Social Security turns 79 this month. With me here to discuss this seminal entitlement program is ARI's Don Watkins. Don is a fellow here at ARI and the author most recently of this book, Roosevelt Care, How Social Security is Sabotaging the Land of Self-Reliance. I'm Steve Simpson, ARI's Director of Legal Studies. All right, Don, let's start from the beginning, as it were. Give us a kind of little bit of background about Social Security, and in particular, I mean, we take it from the title of the book. You think Roosevelt obviously had a lot to do with this. So give us a sense why the title Roosevelt Care, and then I want you to walk back a little bit and just talk about where this idea comes from. Is FDR the one who came up with the idea for a government-run entitlement program, or does it come from somewhere else?
So Social Security was passed in 1935 under FDR, and it really inaugurated the American welfare state. The idea for the welfare state had actually been around since at least the 1880s in its modern form from Bismarck's Germany. And since that point, American progressives, as they would come to be called, advocated for embracing some form of social insurance, as they called it, some form of a welfare state in the United States. Mm-hmm. But for roughly 50 years, Americans by and large resisted. They supported a limited role for government, essentially to protect people's rights, mm-hmm. and viewed the welfare state as something that was not consistent with America and indeed unnecessary. Mm-hmm. And but by 1935, you'd seen a change in various ways. People started to make room for the welfare state, were more open to the idea that government should take on what they thought of as a more active role in the economy. And Roosevelt then is really the one who's able to push it through. And Roosevelt Care is meant to do two things. Number one, it's meant to really position Roosevelt and Social Security as the founding of the American welfare state. And it's meant to draw a parallel today to Obamacare, that many of the complaints that people make about Obamacare and many of the ways in which Obamacare was implemented and many of the things which Obamacare does are just extensions of that first welfare state program, Social Security.
Okay. All right. Well, you said that Americans first kind of resisted this program and then they got acclimated to it. Your subtitle, How Social Security is Sabotaging the Land of Self-Reliance, I think sort of speaks to that. So talk to me a bit about that. In other words, what was it about the American character that was changed or did change in as Americans became sort of more acclimated to the idea of having the government run this entitlement program or the entire welfare state?
Yeah, so I put the stress on self-reliance as one of the defining features of America. And this was a concept that basically stood for the idea that you had a right and a responsibility to tend to your own life, to figure out what you wanted to achieve in life, to find a productive career, and to work really hard to support yourself. Well, that ideal did not die in 1935, but it was always vaguely held, and it always existed with other ideas, such as the idea that you have a responsibility to take care of others and help others. And what happened really in 1935 was a number of things, but I'll just name some of the aspects. So one is that this idea that you have a duty to take care of others became more pronounced. Mm-hmm. And this was mainly driven by our intellectual, religious leaders who really tried to hammer home this idea that, well, yeah, you should support yourself if you can, but you also have a duty to be your brother's mm-hmm. keeper, as they would sometimes put it. And at the same time, there was a real lack of understanding about what self-reliance required and whether it was even possible. So the basic, what was going on in America before the welfare state was people basically supported their own lives through productive work and then through taking efforts to prepare for life's twists and turns. And so, for example, you could lose a job, and so people took steps to prepare for that. One obvious one is there was in some states private unemployment insurance, although other states outlawed it. So you had a situation in which people were trying to support themselves and protect against economic risks. Well, that was a challenging thing to do, and capitalism had only been around for a few decades, really, in its modern form, and it only started to enrich people. And a lot of forms that people could use to prepare for life's twists and turns, including old age, didn't exist yet. So you didn't really have things like annuities developed at the time. And so what you got then in the 1930s was the Great Depression occurred, obviously starting in 1929, and it really shook people up. They had had the view that, well, you could support your own life, your economic destiny was in your control, and that if something really bad did happen to you, which was very rare, you could turn to private charity or other private resources. Well, the Great Depression threw that all into question because suddenly now, even people who wanted to work hard, people who wanted to be responsible, people who were preparing for their lives and building savings and so on, suddenly they found they were out of work and they couldn't do anything about it. And this was particularly hard on the elderly who had trouble working and certainly competing for the scarce amount of jobs that were there. Now, some intellectuals were explaining at the time, such as Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, they were explaining that, look, this was not created by a free market, and you wouldn't get this kind of phenomenon in a free market. But that was not the main message that was told by leaders like FDR, and then by thinkers like John Maynard Keynes. And so what Americans came to believe was the only way that we can truly have economic security is through a welfare state of some sort. Now, they were still resistant and skeptical of a welfare state, and so it wasn't even described as a welfare state. And indeed, to this day, Social Security is often put as, this is not a welfare program, this is one in which you're preparing for your old age. But as we can talk about more, in reality, all Social Security did was transfer wealth from young working people to older Americans. It is welfare through and through.
Okay, and we'll dig down into what you just said, the way that Social Security transfers money from one generation to another as we go. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit more about something that you just touched on, which is this idea, put it this way, I don't think most Americans would look at Social Security as either the beginning of the vast entitlement state that we have today. That is, a lot of people on the right would say, let's get rid of a lot of that, but Social Security, that's the golden program. I mean, that's solidly within the American tradition. And part of the reason they would say that is, hey, look, I put money into the system, I'm saving, I get money out of the system, and so, the fact that the government is managing the system, yeah, all right, maybe it would be better to have a private company manage it, but there's really not a big deal having the government do that. So what's wrong with that idea? Give us a sense of, why isn't this a program that ultimately is consistent with the idea of self-reliance? I'm putting money in, I'm getting money out. Isn't it like a retirement account?
Well, and that goes back to the last point that I made. That is not at all how Social Security works. So to reiterate, all that happens and all that's ever happened in the program is that we tax younger people and we give the money to older people. Now, we also pat the young people in the back and tell them, hey, someday you'll get to tax younger people too, and they'll give you handouts. So that's fundamentally different from a retirement or an investment vehicle in the private economy. And there's two fundamental differences that you have to keep in mind. One is that those things involve some form of productive saving and investment. So it's, I set aside resources that are, say, put into the stock market or the bond market. And that allows companies, for instance, to engage in research and development, to build new factories, new technologies. And I can then draw on that when I'm older. In effect, I've set aside resources that I've created, put them into productive activities, and now I can draw back on that to consume later in life. That's fundamentally different from transfers that basically involve just giving other people my wealth to consume and then taking wealth from other people to consume. The second fundamental difference is that in those private spheres, I get to set aside as much money as I want and put them in things that I regard as a good deal. So if I, for instance, am going to invest in stocks or bonds, I'm going to think about what kind of return am I hoping to achieve, what kind of risk tolerance am I willing to agree with, how much do I want to consume in old age versus how much do I want to consume when I'm younger, and therefore how much will I set aside in the first place. Social Security and the welfare state take that all out of your hands. And what they say is the government's going to decide how much money is taken from you today, and then it's going to decide how much money you get when you're older. It's all dictated by others. And although the government comes out with these statements about what you're supposedly going to achieve or receive when you're older, the fact is that A, it can change those at will, and B, the formulas that determine what you'll receive are so complex and depend on so many factors that one can't project, that in reality, this is the deal that Americans are offered. we're going to take as much money as we want from you today, and we can change it at any point. You have no idea how much you'll be paying over your lifetime. And then when you're older, we're going to give you some amount of money. You don't know how long, you don't know how much. Does that sound like a good deal? To me, that sounds like a horrible deal. It's a ridiculous deal. And if somebody offered it to you privately and voluntarily, first of all, it would probably be a crime. But second of all, nobody would accept that for 1 minute.
All right, so there's a lot packed in there. I want to try to unpack a number of these ideas that you're getting at here. I want to start with something that has always bugged me, right? So periodically, I don't even know when I get these things, but periodically in my mailbox, I will get this statement, basically. It looks like a retirement statement. It talks about all the money I've paid in, which outrages me to no end. And then it talks about the money I'm going to supposedly get out of the Social Security system. Is this statement, I mean, is it just a big lie? Is that essentially what the government is sending these things out for? Are they just trying to lull people into a false sense of security? Or what's wrong with these statements that we get every, do you know? I don't even know how often I get them.
Well, actually, you no longer get them mailed to you because the government's become more efficient.
Good.
But yeah, this is basically, it really is a fraud, because the fact is, it really conveys this idea that we talked about, this complete myth, which is that there is this little savings program that is back there. There's this trust fund or something that money's being set aside the way you would set aside for your child's, education, that you're going to draw on. And it implies that there's some contractual right you have to these funds when you retire. And all of that, as we've talked about, is nonsense. But this is part of what Social Security has done from the beginning, which is, because Americans were skeptical of a welfare state, there's always been these mechanisms to try to portray it as this earned benefit. And so let me give you a different example that I think is even more open and outrageous than just these ridiculous little forms. That is, the program's official name is called insurance. We talk about benefits. We talk about contributions, all of that insurance language. All of that was purposely put there in order to disguise that this was a welfare state program. So you have this situation in which the government's trying to sell it to Americans as insurance, using this insurance language. Well, when the initial bill, Social Security Act, was passed, that language wasn't included. And they took it out precisely because they knew or believed that the Supreme Court would strike it down, because the government doesn't have a right to run a giant insurance program.
Right.
Well, after the Supreme Court came back with this decision that actually the program was constitutional, they said, well, let's go put back that insurance language, because again, it's going to comfort Americans, it's going to make the program more politically popular. And so throughout Social Security's history, we've seen case after case after case in which it's not being described and communicated honestly to Americans. And so when people tell me that Social Security is one of the most popular programs, it's true, it is. But so much of that is based on not telling people the truth about what it is and how it works. And I think if Social Security can't stand that open scrutiny, if it can't stand in the light of day and get the support that it allegedly needs, then maybe it's not such a great program after all.
Okay. So then, just to be really clear, we hear constantly, as you've pointed out, that this is an earned benefit. That's the term I think I hear the most, although we also hear that it's a kind of form of social insurance. You're saying earned benefit, false, not an earned benefit, right?
You can't earn the right to take money from other people.
Okay.
And that's the central issue that's going on.
All right, but the device that they use, so let me take our viewers back. Probably a lot of them won't remember this, but I remember this really clearly. In the 2000 election, this was Bush v. Gore, right? You have Al Gore campaigning. He's going to save the Social Security Trust Fund, right? And he's going to do it by, if everybody remembers this, putting it in a lockbox. Saturday Night Live lampooned that quite well. But so this idea of a trust fund, it sounds like we're all paying into this fund. It's kind of like a retirement fund. And then I pay into that fund. Everybody pays into it. And then at least the money that goes to people to pay out their so-called benefits comes from this fund. Tell us about the trust fund. Is there such a thing? What does it even mean?
Well, there is, and there's actually an office you can go to where they literally have a fund, and this is where the bonds that constitute the Social Security Trust Fund are held. But you have to be clear on exactly what it is. Okay. So first of all, the vast majority of the tax money that Social Security takes in each year is handed directly out to the elderly. But since 1983, we started the actual tax revenues were far higher than the handouts being paid to the elderly. And so what happened is Social Security basically handed the money over to the Treasury. The Treasury doled it out to other government spending programs, and in return, Social Security got a whole bunch of government bonds. Now, since 2010, Social Security has been taking in less in tax revenue than it's been handing out in the form of Social Security checks. And how then has it been making up the difference? Well, fundamentally, it gets complex because part of what they do is that they have certain interest on the trust fund. But basically what ultimately happens is that those bonds in the trust fund get redeemed from the Treasury. Now, how's that paid for? One of two ways, either taxes or government borrowing, which is ultimately has to be paid for in other taxes. So there's no resources in the trust fund. Again, take the example of preparing for your child's education. I'm sure you're saving for your kid's education. I know we've started just saving for mine. We have to spend less and set aside money, invest it, so that when the time comes, we can take that money out and actually pay for our kids' education. We're setting aside resources for the future. That is not happening in Social Security. The so-called trust fund, it's meaningful only in one sense, not in any economic sense, not in the sense of resources being set aside. It's only meaningful in a political sense, which is Social Security is only allowed to pay out its paychecks so long as it's either receiving tax revenue or it can cash in bonds from the trust fund. And what will happen is, as it draws down in that trust fund over the next few decades, that trust fund is ultimately going to run out. And Social Security, unless it can get changes in the law that allow it to tax more, it will have to cut the paychecks that it sends to people. It doesn't have the authority to automatically increase taxes or to borrow from the government. And so politically, the trust fund is relevant because if nothing changes, then in 2033, according to the latest estimates, in 2033, the payments made by Social Security will have to be slashed by 23%, or the payroll tax will have to rise by between 3 and 4%, or some other change in the law to make up that difference.
All right, so let's talk about then, again, I want to return to a lot of the ideas that you've been getting into here. One of the things you said earlier was that people view Social Security as something that they have a right to, kind of an ownership right, but that's not really true. So I want you to explain what the myth is there and how do we know that that's not true?
So it is a myth that people have a right to it. What does it mean to have a right to something? It means that you have a claim that nobody can interfere with it. And ultimately that's going to be protected by the law. It's going to be protected by the government. So for instance, if you and I have a contract that you're going to deliver me, 10 cupcakes and I'm going to deliver you $10, and you deliver the cupcakes and I don't give you the $10, that's a contract that's been broken, and you can go to the government and obviously get some kind of recompense. Now, that is not true, and indeed the Supreme Court found in the 1960s, I believe it was, in Fleming versus Nestor, they said explicitly, no, this is not a contractual right because that would bind the government's ability to be experimental and so on. This is something that, just like every other law, Congress has the right to change at any time it wants. And I think this is really important because think of it at the name, Social Security. And the idea is that you have a right to this, you're secure. We're not going to leave you at the mercy of your ability to save and invest sensibly. We're going to guarantee you some sort of income. But this is a, quote, guarantee that can be waived by Congress anytime it wants. And in the future, as we will talk about, I assume, it's going to have to change that because the benefits as they're currently scheduled cannot be paid.
Well, let's talk about that actually, because you said earlier that it was taking in more in tax dollars than it was paying out. I think you said it up until about the 1970s. What changed then, and what is the sort of prognosis going forward?
Well, the way that it actually worked was, for most of Social Security's history, they basically tried to bounce through taxes and handouts keep them about level. And the trust fund was basically a way in which one year you get a little more in taxes, and then one year you get a little less, and we'll keep it stable. But what happened during the 70s is Social Security's payments had been increased, become more generous, it'll sometimes be put, since the 1950s, virtually since it was created. And that seemed great. People were getting all these wonderful payments that they didn't have to pay much for in terms of taxes, because the payroll tax was relatively low. And there were, depending on what time frame you're looking at, say 1950, there were roughly, I think, 16 workers per every retiree. So the cost for the worker was relatively small, and the payment for the recipient was large relative to what he or she had paid in taxes. Well, as the benefits started to get bigger, and as the number of people who were paying taxes over the course of their lifetime increased, what happened is that by the time you hit the 70s, Social Security was not on a sound trajectory. That is, something radical had to change in order to keep it making the promised payments. And so what you got was this big deal under Reagan, who saved Social Security essentially in 1983, that put us on our modern trajectory. And this was supposed to keep Social Security in a sound economic footing for 75 years. In fact, obviously, that hasn't happened, because all that happened was there was a huge run-up in the trust fund that was thought to be able to cover the cost of Social Security into the future. But as we talked about, there was no fund there, there was no wealth there, there was no set-aside resources. So we faced this shortfall not 75 years from 1983, but decades sooner. And so the fact is that something is going to have to change. And right now the payroll tax is at 12.4%. For the most Americans, that's the largest tax they pay. That is very likely going to rise several percent, which doesn't sound like much until you really put that in terms of what percentage tax increase is that. It's really a 23% or more tax increase that Americans are going to face in order to continue the benefits being paid, or the benefits are going to have to be cut. And so we're going to have to debate. This is going to happen one way or the other. Something is going to change, and the debate is, well, what should change? And I think to answer that question, you need to step back a little bit. And that's what my book is really about. It's about stepping back and saying, wait a minute, let's not assume that this is a good program that we just have to figure out how do we make the finances work. The real question is this a moral program? And what I argue in the book is that no, it's not. That people should have the right to their money that they earn and to use it to plan for their entire life, including their retirement, as they judge best.
So what's the main argument against that position? What do you hear when you go out on the road and you make these arguments to left, right, anybody else?
Well, one of them is this earned benefit argument. And I can sympathize with the fact that, look, you've been taxed throughout your life for something, and you've made plans based on the idea that you'll get something when you're older. But as we talked about, that's not right. Now, you may think that Social Security is we need it for some other reason, but it's not true that because you were taxed to pay for other people's retirement, you therefore have a moral right to tax other people for your retirement. But then there's really two other major sorts of arguments, and there's a lot of little ones, but the two major ones are this. So one is that you have a moral obligation as a society to pay for and guarantee the retirement of the elderly. The other argument is that it is focused more on you as an individual, and it says, look, we're guaranteeing you economic security because we don't think that you can make those sound judgments and investment judgments and rational planning for your economic affairs on your own. Now, both of those arguments, I think, are hopeless. So first of all, I don't think it's true that you are your brother's keeper or your grandfather's keeper. I don't think there's any justification for the idea that a person's need entitles him to support from others. Now let's separate that out from, do we want to help people? Because if I was in a position where my parents needed help in retirement, they needed a place to live. Thankfully, I think they're very far from needing that. But that may be something that I do as part of my own interest. I value these people. I want to help them out. And I would certainly do so under those circumstances. That's very different from the idea that a person's entitled to support by others. And I always like to say you have to put it in the first person. You're the one who's in need. Say, say you need help, right? You have reached retirement and, you happen to invest everything in Enron or Madoff or the equivalent at that time, and now you need support. Would you go to your neighbor or somebody else and say, hey, I made some bad decisions or I hit some bad luck, you owe me? I don't think most Americans would view their bad situation as a debt on others. But that's what the welfare state does. It doesn't say, hey, you should be free to ask people to help you, and maybe they should help you voluntarily if they value you. It says, no, your need, whatever your source, whether it was you made dumb decisions or irrational decisions or irresponsible decisions, regardless of that, your need entitles you to support. So I think that is a really unjust idea. Now, we can make a lot short shrift with this idea of you're unable to support your own life. The fact is that the vast majority of people can and do support their own lives throughout their lives, from when they're young and working to when they're old. And if they couldn't, you couldn't afford a welfare state anyway. And the fact, do some people make irresponsible decisions? Absolutely, but you don't sacrifice the rational and responsible to the irrational and unresponsible. And I totally reject this idea that, well, you know what, we're just all so helplessly irrational that we need these rational people in Washington to make our decisions for us.
So what do you say to a guy in my position, 49 years old, be retiring, I don't know, 15, 17 years, something like that? We're going to get rid of Social Security. What, you're left out in the cold with no way to recoup what you've put in? Is there a phase out? I mean, what are the ideas on the table, and what do you say about how we deal with people who are older than me, let's say, and nearing retirement?
Well, the ideas on the table are all bad. All the ideas that are, quote, on the table are ideas that are aimed at rescuing Social Security, or indeed in many cases, such as the ideas championed by, say, Senator Elizabeth Warren, are expanding Social Security, which is just irresponsible and insane at this point in time. But what should be on the table? And I do agree with you. I don't think you can just say, all right, we're going to abolish this overnight, and hey, Steve, let alone somebody who's 64 years old, good luck to you. I think you do have to have some plan of phasing it out. Now, there have not actually, frankly, been many plans developed. There's a handful, and most of them are problematic to one extent or another. I think the first issue is get this issue on the table, get the alternative of a truly free market where the government can't take as much money as it wants from you on for whatever purpose it regards as in the public interest. Get them to value the idea of you get to keep what you earn and use it as you judge best on the table. And then let's get economists, political scientists, policymakers to start coming up with real proposals for unwinding. Because the big problem is not that, well, we can't think of any good ways to do it, it's impossible. The fact is that transitions are always going to be rough, but that's a problem created by Social Security, and it's not a justification for continuing an injustice. If something is immoral and unjust, which I think Social Security clearly is, then what you need is you need to devote the human mind to figuring out, well, how do we limit the destructiveness of the injustice? And I think it's also important to put in this, to remind ourselves in this context. The choice is not between our wonderful system today and all the wonderful benefits it's going to be giving to people and how much more prosperous we are because of Social Security, and then Don Watkins saying, let's just take it away from people. What we have is a program that's been enormously economically destructive, that is going to really, even if you think Social Security is offering you a good deal today, for my daughter, likely for your children, the amount that they're going to get from Social Security compared to what they pay for your retirement and your parents' retirement is not going to come close. They're going to be huge losers, and indeed, this is a complex argument, but I've argued elsewhere, including the book, that everyone, including the people retiring today, are losers, just on the financial economic side. So all that said, the bottom line is that this is something we need to think about, but it's not the hardest problem. I mean, the fact is, the easiest solution is that you just set aside, say, 20 years, 30 years, if you're really slow going, some amount of time in which you just ratchet down how much people are going to get, and they have to make plans. Now, I think actually morally you should do it much faster, and I'm much more a fan of proposals that would say something along the lines of, look, we're getting rid of the welfare state in say, a year or two, and then going to just give people, say, one, negative income tax for 10 years, and after that, you're on your own. And I think that makes the adjustment harder in the sense that the adjustment is much bigger and the span of time to deal with it is much shorter. But it also gets you to a free society and therefore prosperity at a much faster rate, and it ends the injustice in a much faster rate.
All right, so bad program, going to get worse in the future. You're arguing against it on fundamental grounds. Who else out there is making the same argument that you're making?
Well, I mean, the sad part is that nobody, and even people who are very sympathetic to a free market, and even people who will say just generally that they're against the welfare state, say very little about Social Security. And those who are better on the issue, almost always their plan is some form of so-called privatization. I think that is both unnecessary and politically ineffective, but also very dangerous. And I don't want to go into some too much detail, but let me just name one reason I think it's dangerous. You can come up with an ideal theory of privatization where in effect Americans get to set aside their money in something like a 401k. Okay, that may not be the end of the world, and it would certainly be better on average than what we have today, certainly less economically destructive. But that's very unlikely that that's how it would work. Far more likely is that you would get some government-controlled savings and investment vehicle that will suddenly make the government the largest private investor in private companies in the economy. And plans like this were actually proposed during the early debates over how to finance Social Security. And many critics said, and I think this is right, that this would in effect be the socialization of the American economy. You can't give government that much control over that much private investment. So I think going down that road is a dangerous road, and it's unnecessary, because why haven't we accepted these sensible plans already? Well, if you accept the basic premise of Social Security that the government should control how you plan for your old age, then so long as you accept that, people aren't going to accept this sort of private enterprise. And on the other hand, if they would accept that, it's because they've challenged that view and think, no, we're competent to make our own decisions and we have a right to make our own decisions, in which case the government has no right to tell you what to do with that money, whether to set it aside for retirement or whether to use it for crucial needs that you have now.
Mm-hmm. All right, so you've written the book. You're writing, I think, in other contexts and about this issue. What does the future hold for you on this, on the issue of Social Security and entitlements in general?
So this is part of a broader effort in a campaign that I call the End the Debt Draft campaign. And that is that if we look at the numbers of where the welfare state is leading us, somewhere between $100 to $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities are on the table, which, just translating that into kind of simple rule of thumb, means our kids are going to go broke. And so, and that's why I say they're being drafted into debt. They're going to have to set aside a lot of their hopes and dreams in order to serve the elderly, in order to pay for their health care, in order to pay for their retirement. I mean, already a young person entering the job market is paying more than a new car payment each month to the elderly, and it's going to get far, far worse. So this is part of that campaign, the work I'm doing on Social Security. But more broadly, it's part of a larger effort to get people to rethink the welfare state. And so I think one of the key issues that has really come to define the debate over the welfare state is inequality. So that's another area that I hope to be doing work in the future. But I think if people want to learn more about these efforts and these issues, they can definitely check out Roosevelt Care. It's on Amazon. But they can also visit endthedebtdraft.com, where they can find a lot more material, including a free PDF of the book that they can read or send any of their friends or family. All right. So there's no excuse.
Good. Well, any parting thoughts before we end?
Yeah, I would say this. I would say that you really need to challenge the conventional framework. All of these debates over the welfare state, and specifically Social Security, start midstream. They all start with the assumption of clearly it's great that people are getting all these handouts, and we just need to figure out how to make them sensible. And I think it's critical in any debate not to start midstream, but to always be clear on why are we doing this? And is there really a good reason to do this? Because the fact is that historically, economically, and morally, individuals are capable of planning for their own lives, and they have a right to plan for their own lives. You have a right to decide whether you set aside 12.4% of your income for your retirement, whether you hand that 12.4% over to current retirees, or whether you use it or some portion of it to achieve the goals and dreams and values that you have in your life now. So if you want to use it right, if you want to use your money right now to pay for your schooling, or to start a new business, or to buy a car that you desperately need, or to pay for a health care that you desperately need, you have the right to do that. And it's completely immoral, it's totally wrong for the government to say, no, you can't do that. You have to pay for other people's retirement, for other people's health care, and it's no better to say, well, don't worry, other people will be forced to pay for yours someday. We don't have to be in that situation of dog-eat-dog victimizations where you sacrifice for my sake and I'm forced to sacrifice for your sake, and supposedly we'll all come out on top in that kind of game. No, we all come out losers in that game. And so what I advocate at the Ayn Rand Institute, what Ayn Rand advocated, was a system where nobody's forced to sacrifice for anybody, where each of us are free to pursue our hopes and dreams and use the money we earn from that process, from a productive career, in order to create for ourselves the best life possible. That's what I advocate, and I think if you step back and ask those big picture questions, I think that's what most Americans in the end would advocate.
All right, thanks, Don.
Thank you, Steve.